There is a man whose mail you have been reading for 2,000 years. You probably never thought of it that way. You open your Bible, you find a chapter, you read a few verses, and you move on. But almost every one of those pages near the back was once a piece of personal mail. Someone folded it, someone hid it under their cloak, and carried it for weeks across mountains and open sea. Someone stood up in a small room full of frightened people, unrolled it, and read it out loud while everyone held their breath. 13 of those letters were written by one man, a man who never met Jesus while Jesus was alive, a man who, before any of this, spent his days hunting down Christians and dragging them out of their homes by force. Have you ever wondered what you would actually sound like if your private letters, the ones written in your worst weeks and your most desperate ones, were collected, copied, and read aloud to strangers for 20 centuries? Every fear you put on paper, every time you begged, every time you lost your temper. That is exactly what happened to this man. And here is the part almost nobody tells you. He did not write them in the order you read them. The Bible arranges Paul's letters roughly by length, longest to shortest. It is a filing system, not a timeline. But that is not the order he lived them. Read them in the order he actually wrote them, and something happens to you. You stop seeing a saint frozen in stained glass. You start watching a real human being change, letter by letter, year by year. From a furious young convert with everything to prove into an old man in a freezing cell, writing his final words by the light of a single lamp. So tonight we are going to read his mail in order. All 13 letters, the way they actually happened, from the first to the last. And I am going to ask you to hold on to two things along the way, one word and one promise, because both of them come back at the end and they will mean something completely different by the time we get there. Let me show you who he was when he picked up his pen for the very first time. His name was Saul. He was a Pharisee, trained in Jerusalem under Gamaliel, the most respected rabbi of his generation. He was a Roman citizen by birth and a scholar of the law by training, a rare and powerful combination. He was the kind of religious man who was certain, completely, dangerously certain that he was right, and he used that certainty to hurt people who disagreed with him. The historian Luke tells us he stood guard over the coats of the men who stoned Stephen, the first Christian killed for his faith, and that he approved of the killing. He was not a bystander. He was an organizer of violence, convinced he was defending God. Then, on a dusty road to Damascus, a light brighter than the noon sun knocked him flat, and a voice he could not argue with asked him one question. "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" He got up blind. For 3 days he could not see, and he did not eat or drink. Then his sight came back, and the man who had been hunting Christians had become one of them. The Greek word the New Testament uses for this kind of change is metanoia. We usually translate it repentance, but that is far too small. It does not mean feeling sorry. It is built from meta, meaning beyond or change, and nous, meaning the mind. It means your entire way of thinking turns inside out. Not a man who fixed his behavior, a man whose whole center of gravity moved to a new place and stayed there. Years passed, more than a decade of them. He preached, he traveled, he worked with his hands making tents to pay his own way, and he planted small, fragile churches in towns most people could not find on a map. And then, around the year 48, in a borrowed room somewhere, he sat down and wrote the first letter we still have. It was not gentle. The letter is Galatians, and Paul is furious. Picture the situation. He had visited a region called Galatia, told a handful of ordinary people the most freeing news they had ever heard, and moved on to the next town. Then other teachers arrived behind him and said, in effect, that is a nice start, but to really belong to God, you also have to keep all the old rules, every dietary law, every ritual, the whole system perfectly. And Paul's new friends believed them. You can feel his heart breaking through the ink. In every other letter he opens with warmth, with thanksgiving, with a blessing. Here he skips all of it. He writes, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the freedom you were given, and he does not slow down for 9 chapters. I want you to hold on to that word, freedom. That is the first of the 2 things I asked you to carry, because Paul is about to spend the rest of his life paying for that one word, and we are going to come back to what it finally cost him. Here's the question Galatians forces on you, and it is not an ancient question at all. Do you secretly believe God will love you more if you perform better? That if you just pray harder, give more, sin less, show up more, then finally, eventually you will be acceptable? Be honest. Almost every person carries that quiet arithmetic somewhere inside. We say grace is free, and then we live as if there is an invoice coming, and we are always behind on the payments. Paul looked straight at that fear and called it by a startling name. He called it a different gospel, a counterfeit. He said if you could earn your way in by your own performance, then Christ died for nothing. The cross would be a cruel joke. You were set free, he told them, in order to be free. That is Galatians, a young man on fire, defending the one thing he was certain would save the people he loved. A year or two later, the tone changes completely. Now Paul is in the city of Corinth, and his mind keeps drifting back to a little church he had to abandon in a hurry, up north in a place called Thessalonica. He had been run out of that town by an angry mob before he could finish teaching them. He never got to say goodbye properly, and now he is worried about them the way you worry about someone you love who is too far away for you to protect. He writes them 2 letters, and they are tender. He tells them he cared for them like a nursing mother caring for her own children, and that he had been torn away from them, and how he longed to see their faces again. This is the same man who, 1 letter ago, was breathing fire. Same man, different week. That is the first thing reading them in order teaches you. Paul was not one mood. He was a whole person. But the Thessalonians have a specific terror, and it is a strangely modern one. Some of the believers have died, and the rest are panicking. Did those people miss out on everything? Was the whole hope a lie because they did not live long enough to see it come true? They were waiting for what Paul called the parousia, a Greek word that means an arrival or a royal presence, the term you would use for an emperor visiting a city. They expected Jesus to return in their lifetimes, and now their friends were in the ground, and they did not know what it meant. Paul writes back to grieving people, and notice carefully what he does not do. He does not tell them to stop crying. He does not scold them for being sad. He tells them to grieve differently, to grieve not as those who have no hope. It is one of the most honest sentences about death ever written. He does not promise it will not hurt. He promises it is not the end of the story. Then comes the chaos. If Galatians is Paul angry and Thessalonians is Paul tender, then 1 Corinthians is Paul exhausted. The church in Corinth is a disaster. And Corinth itself was a rough port city, famous across the empire for its temples, its money, and its loose living. The church had soaked up the city. They were suing each other in pagan courts. They were getting drunk at the sacred meal while poorer members went hungry. They had split into rival fan clubs. I follow this teacher. Well, I follow that one. Well, I follow Christ, as if the gospel were a celebrity contest. There was a man in the congregation openly sleeping with his stepmother, and the church was proud of how broad-minded they were being about it. Paul works through every single mess, one by one, like a tired parent who came home to a wrecked house and has to deal with every room. And then, right in the middle of correcting these difficult, divided, immature people, he stops the argument cold and writes one paragraph that outlived everything around it. You have heard it. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. 1 Corinthians 13 read at more weddings than any other passage in the Bible. But here is what nobody mentions while the bride is walking down the aisle. Paul did not write those words about romance. The Greek word he uses is agape, not romantic love, not friendship, but a deliberate, self-giving love that chooses the good of another person regardless of how you feel about them. And he wrote it to a church that could barely stand to be in the same room. He was telling people who were actively feuding and suing each other exactly what real love would require of them. Patience, kindness, keeping no record of wrongs. He held a mirror up to their worst behavior and described its exact opposite so beautifully that 300 generations later, we read it to brides and weep. The second letter to Corinth is even more raw and personal. Here Paul stops defending his teaching and starts defending his very life, because people had been mocking him. He is not impressive in person, they sneered. His speaking is weak. Look how much he suffers. Surely God would protect a genuine apostle from all that. And Paul's answer is one of the bravest things in any of his letters. He lists his sufferings, not to brag, but to redefine what strength even means. Beaten with rods 3 times, given 39 lashes 5 times, shipwrecked on 3 separate occasions, a full day and night adrift in the open sea, in danger from rivers, from bandits, from his own people, from strangers, from false friends, hungry, cold, sleepless. And then he tells them what God said to him when he begged for relief, 3 times from a private torment he never even names. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Not power that removes the weakness, power that is perfected inside it. Around the year 57, Paul writes the letter that scholars often call his masterpiece. He is still in Corinth, and he is planning to finally visit a church he has never met. The believers in Rome itself, the beating heart of the empire, the most important city in the world. He cannot just show up cold to a community like that. So he writes ahead and he makes a decision. He is going to lay the whole thing out, beginning to end, the most complete, careful explanation of his entire message that he ever committed to paper. This is Romans. If the other letters are Paul running from fire to fire with a bucket, Romans is Paul sitting down to build a cathedral, stone by stone. He starts in the basement with the bad news, and he refuses to let anyone escape it. Everyone is broken. Religious people who keep the rules and irreligious people who break them. All of us, every category, no exceptions. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Nobody gets to feel superior in Romans. Then, having leveled the ground so no one is standing higher than anyone else, he begins to climb, floor by floor, toward the news he could never stop talking about. That you are made right with God, not by your record, not by your performance, but by trust, handed to you as a pure gift. The Greek word underneath it all is charis, grace, a gift that by definition cannot be earned, because the moment you earn it, it stops being a gift and becomes a wage. And he ends the climb with a promise so large it is almost hard to read slowly. Nothing, not death, not life, not angels, not the present, not the future, not your worst day, not your buried past, will be able to separate us from the love of God. Now remember the freedom he fought for in that first furious letter, 15 years and a dozen scars earlier? In Romans, older and calmer, he finally has the room and the peace to lay out the entire architecture of it. Same conviction, a lifetime of weight behind it now, and then the letters go quiet for a while. Because Paul gets arrested. This is the turn. Everything changes here. He is taken into Roman custody in Jerusalem, held for 2 years, and eventually, because he is a citizen, he appeals to be tried before the emperor himself. So he is shipped to Rome in chains, surviving along the way one more shipwreck, and from captivity, awaiting a trial that could end in his execution, he writes 4 more letters. And they are not at all what you would expect from a man in prison. The first goes to Philippi, a Roman colony that loved him dearly. And Philippians, written by a man who genuinely does not know whether he will live or die, is the most joyful letter he ever wrote. He uses the word joy and tells them to rejoice over and over from inside a cell. He writes, I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. And then he hands them the secret, and it is not positive thinking or denial. It is this, for to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. He has arrived somewhere most of us never reach, a place where neither outcome holds any power to frighten him anymore. Living is good, dying is also good. There is no threat left. The second prison letter goes to Colossae, a town he had never even visited in person. Strange teachers had crept in, telling the believers that Jesus was a fine beginning, but not quite enough, that they needed extra rituals, extra spiritual experiences, secret hidden knowledge to be truly complete. And Paul answers with one of the highest things ever written about who Jesus actually is. In Christ, he says, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Not a fragment of God, not a representative of God, all of it, in a human life. There is nothing to add. There is no upgrade to buy. The third prison letter is the shortest of all, and the most personal thing he ever wrote. It is a single page, and it is about one runaway slave. His name was Onesimus. He had belonged to a Christian man named Philemon, and he had run away, possibly after stealing money to fund his escape, which under Roman law could have cost him his life. He fled all the way to Rome, somehow crossed paths with Paul in prison, and there, of all places, became a believer. Now Paul is sending him back home, carrying this very letter in his own hands, and the letter is a quiet, careful, almost trembling plea. Paul asks Philemon to receive Onesimus back, not as property, not as a criminal, but as a beloved brother. He even offers to cover any debt out of his own pocket. If he owes you anything, charge it to me. Sit with what is happening on that page. A man in chains, stripped of every kind of worldly power, is using the only thing he has left in the world, his words and the love people have for him, to shield a powerless man and quietly dismantle the cruelty standing between two human beings. No grand speech about abolishing slavery. Just this, aimed straight at one heart. He is your brother now. Treat him like one. History would take centuries to catch up to that single page. The fourth prison letter is Ephesians, and it reads like a man who has finally stopped arguing and simply started to worship. It is calm, it is enormous in scope, and it contains the one line that holds his whole life together. The sentence that explains everything that happened to him on that road and everything after. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not the result of works, so that no one may boast. Think about who is writing that. The man who once tried to earn God's approval by destroying God's people, the man who held the coats at a stoning, now cannot stop saying 100 different ways the one truth that broke him open. You did not earn this. You could never have earned this. It was a gift the entire time. And then we come to the end. The last three letters, the ones written by an old man who can feel the road running out. These are called the pastoral letters, two written to a young pastor named Timothy, one to another named Titus. Paul is no longer planting churches now. He is mentoring the next generation to keep them alive after he is gone. You can hear him trying to hand everything over while there is still time. He tells Timothy to guard carefully what he was taught. He tells him not to let anyone look down on him for being young. He warns him about the people who will drift away. He sounds like every aging teacher who lies awake at night wondering whether the students were really listening, whether any of it will hold once the teacher is gone. And then there is the very last letter. 2 Timothy. Almost everyone who studies these letters believes this is the final thing Paul ever wrote. He is in Rome again, but this time there is no rented house, no soldiers he can preach to, no comfort at all. This time, according to early Christian tradition recorded by the historian Eusebius, it is the reign of the Emperor Nero. The persecution is brutal, and Paul is in a cold dungeon waiting to be executed. And he knows exactly how it ends. So read what an apostle writes when he knows the sword is coming. He asks Timothy to come to him quickly before winter. He asks him to bring the cloak he left behind in another city because he is cold. He asks for his books, and especially the parchments. Small, ordinary, human, heartbreaking details. An old man, cold and alone in the dark, asking a friend to please hurry and please bring my coat. Most of his friends have already left him, and he names them by name, the way the lonely do. He says at his first defense, no one stood with him, everyone deserted him. And then, with the executioner's shadow already on the wall, he writes the words that close the entire story. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. That is the man, from the very first furious letter or the way to the last quiet one. From a young Pharisee so certain he was right that he dragged trembling families out of their homes, to an old prisoner, cold and abandoned and condemned, certain at the end of only one thing, that he had been loved without earning it, and he had not wasted the gift. 13 letters, written across roughly 20 years, in the gaps between beatings and shipwrecks and prison cells, to people who were confused and frightened and constantly failing. People, in other words, exactly like us. And here's the thing I genuinely could not stop thinking about, reading them in the order he lived them. Paul never knew you would read these. He believed he was writing to a few hundred ordinary people in a handful of small, struggling towns. He thought these were just letters, temporary, practical, dealing with this month's crisis, to be read aloud once and then tucked away on a shelf. He had no idea they would outlive the empire that killed him. He had no idea the very dungeon and the very emperor would crumble into dust while his cold, handwritten, please bring my coat letter was still being read out loud in languages that did not yet exist. He had no idea that 2,000 years later, someone exactly like you would be sitting somewhere in the quiet, carrying the very same fear he poured into that first furious letter to Galatia, the fear that you are not enough, that the love is conditional, that there is an invoice coming and you are behind on the payments. He could not possibly have known, but every single line he ever wrote was already pointing here, to this moment, to you. The letters were never really about him. He was writing to you.